I now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Hawaii, Mr. Case.
Thank you so much, Chair Yarmouth, Ranking Member Smith, members of the committee. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share some broader thoughts with you today, and I do deeply appreciate this committee's Member Day tradition. I need not dwell on the true state of our national budget by any measure. Annual deficits, total debt, debt to GDP, interest as a percentage of, and on, it is severe and worsening. The only measure cited as positive, year-over-year deficit improvement, is meaningless against a baseline of necessary but actual record COVID deficit spending. For those dwindling few who care about budgets and deficits and debts and other such annoying and obstructive concepts, these are hard times. We are told they don't matter, that we can have our cake and eat it too. Budgets are treated as pure balancing exercises, if that, as opposed to fiscal, monetary, economic, and social policy direction. Guardrail rules like PAYGO against our worst inclinations towards rationalization, short-term gratification, and avoidance are ignored. Budget rules like reconciliation are co-opted. The honest reporters like the Congressional Budget Office are demonized. We are stuck in an endless debate and gyration between feed the beast and starve the beast, united only by a common purpose of driving the budget into a deeper hole. How do we return to a fiscally and, yes, thus economically and socially sustainable path? Do we dare to start by attempting to agree on some common principles, as in stabilizing annual deficits and the national debt will fight inflation, will promote economic growth, work, and investment, will slow the growth of federal interest costs, and will secure our major trust funds for future generations? Can we also agree that the inverse is equally true and destructive? Can we then pursue some difficult but constructive advances towards some restored discipline and stability? Here are just a few. Number one, the Sustainable Budget Act. This proposal, introduced by me and others this Congress on a bipartisan, bicameral basis, would establish a National Commission on Fiscal Responsibility and Reform to identify policies to achieve fiscal sustainability over the long term. This commission would have access to expedited legislative procedures to pass recommendations to balance the budget and meaningfully improve the long-term fiscal outlook. Yes, of course, similar approaches in the past have not ultimately succeeded, but it was not for lack of constructive effort and, measured against the alternative of the current status quo, which is virtually nothing, it is at least demonstrated effort and progress. Number two, the Trust Act. This proposal, also bipartisan and bicameral by me and others, would take steps to secure the endangered species of Social Security and Medicare by similar means. To critics, same comments as a Sustainable Budget Act. Number three, transparent budget information and analysis. It seems so obvious that accurate information about the true impacts of legislation on the fiscal health of the nation is essential. Yet from the sounds of it, that's a mortal threat. This year, for example, over puzzling obstacles, the House passed the Fiscal State of the Nation resolution, a good first step. However, in many ways, we are still legislatively blind to the full impacts of our own decisions by our own hand. We too often proceed with floor votes without CBO scoring. Furthermore, CBO scoring does not include the cost of servicing the debt, which means every time legislation increases the debt, we are not accounting for the full cost of that legislation on the federal budget. We must change that. And finally, the Conrad rule. We must re-examine how Congress approaches budget reconciliation, a process that was and is focused on budget discipline and decision, not as a general filibuster circumvention tool. We should adopt legislation that I've introduced to reinstate the Conrad rule, which would require all reconciliation bills to be budget neutral to go with renewed scrutiny on any appropriate reconciliation. These are just a few baby steps down a long and difficult road back to some form of fiscal sustainability. I hope we can take them step by step before it's too late. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Case.
We'll kind of give it to all three of you. First of all, I was a little bit amazed by that testimony. I mean, our big problem in this country right now is inflation, which is entirely caused by past excessive spending. And you just gave us a long list of programs that you could argue really aren't even constitutional programs. And I think, at least in Wisconsin, and I'm under the impression in other states, the states are running surpluses, big surpluses. So why we, under any circumstances, would allow people back home to believe it's up to ask the federal government for more things when the state are running surpluses, I don't know. But I'm going to give the same question to all three of you, just a quick yes or no. And by the way, there's a shot at Republicans just like Democrats, because when we were in charge and had all three, we did an abysmal job. Would each one of the three of you, would you be supportive of a budget out of this committee that's zero across the board, just boom, zero across the board? Because I know there's waste everywhere, and just we'll rattle down the three of you. Should we ask them that? That's what I'm going to try to talk to Mr. Yarmouth about.
It's your time. You can ask him if you want to. You've already asked it, so they could respond.
Mr. Grothman, I'm in full support of zero-based budgeting.
I mean, zero budget on all.
No, he's saying zero budget, not zero-based budget.
Just out of this committee, zero increase, same as last year.
Oh, zero increase. Yeah, okay. Zero increase. I'm all for whatever we can do on fiscal control, zero increase, whatever we can do to be able to manage our spending. Yes.
I mean, sir, I'm for PAYGO, bottom line. I think there are areas that we do need to increase spending, but they should be budget neutral. We should well, we can have a debate over that. But my point to you in the testimony is at least do that on a budget responsible basis. And so that's gonna lead you to reductions or increase in taxes, reductions or increases in spending, as long as you do it on a budget sustainable basis over time. We can then engage in a broader policy debate about what we're actually talking about right now. But unless we get to that baseline of responsible fiscal principles, the bottom line is we're going to drive the bigger picture budget into a hole, and that's going to have consequences.
I would not support just zero. I think it's, frankly, I've never heard such a recommendation before. I was formerly the city controller in Houston and oversaw the budget and investments for a very large city, multi-billion-dollar budget and investment portfolio. I think if anyone would have presented that to me back then, I would have frankly just laughed because there are just so many things that happen that are out of control. Insurance increases, costs of employees, budget things that are out of our control that just happen with time that you couldn't run a government if you just did zero. So I would say no.
Mr. Chairman, too, if I can add, the one place where there would need to be some sort of statutory exception would be for national security in case of a national emergency. I think you have to have that provision there.
But his proposal will not allow any increase if it's zero.
I don't think maybe if something happens in the future, not now. We're not in an emergency yet.
Okay. Anyone else? Well, oh, yes, I'm sorry. Mr. Donald.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members, thanks for coming. I'm going to piggyback a little bit off of Mr. Grothman. I know Mr. Grothman's essential proposal is a 0% increase in the budget baseline. And then having us basically have a flat budget outlook moving forward. So we're not dealing with CBO essentially coming back to us with an inflation kicker that, frankly, nobody examines except for maybe a handful of staff and maybe the chair and ranking member of the budget committee and the relevant appropriating committees. I'm gonna attack a different way. In the budget apparatus, there are 20 budget functions that basically create the 12 budgetary categories that we appropriate off of. These budget functions range from income security down to, I forget the smallest one. What do you guys believe, or what do you think about essentially taking the largest budget function, the smallest budget function, there are 20, and then Congress basically, for lack of a better phrase, zeroing out those budget functions, and then in each calendar year, you rebuild those two budget functions from the ground up. That way, let's take income security, that way, if you zero it out, the relevant agencies that spend money in those budget functions would have to come to Congress and actually advocate for the money. Then Congress would have the responsibility of rebuilding the budget function from the ground up. It's not saying there will be no money spent in income security. What it is saying is that in this calendar year, we zero out income security. The relevant agencies come and actually have to ask for the money. And then Congress has the responsibility of rebuilding it so we can actually get at waste, get at ineffective programs that are outdated, probably get rid of programs that we just fund where there's no legislative authority anymore to fund them. My question to the panel is, what is your viewpoint on a proposal like that? Which is a hybrid of Mr. Grothman's.
Mr. Donald, what you describe is exactly what zero-based budgeting is. Everybody starts at zero, and then you build a budget each year based upon what the priorities are, and then you have to come in and substantiate what your request is. So I'm 100% in favor of zero-based budgeting.
Yeah, I think it is different from what Mr. Rothman has described. You're just talking about basic zero-based budgeting, which I think is a concept that is wise and appropriate. I sit on the Appropriations Committee. We do try to go back and ask the basic questions every year, starting back to the beginning. Is this function a good function? Is it spending wisely? Should it be increased? Should it be reduced? That is also, by the way, of course, the responsibility of all of the authorizing committees and the House Committee on Oversight. So we all have a responsibility in taking ourselves back to the beginning every fiscal year. That's how our system is set up. The question is whether we're doing it wisely or not. But I agree with you in principle. We need to be asking these questions every year.
I think the current budget system lends itself to doing that. I think each member can start at zero and then move in whatever direction they want to when they come here, when they go through the whole process. And I think the bigger challenge, because our budget is so large and is so diverse in terms of those categories that you're talking about, the bigger challenge would be is to decide which is the most important function and where are you going to start with zeroing out which function. And that's would be a bigger battle that I think it's an interesting thought and certainly merits some discussion.
Well, actually, I got a proposal for you. Glad you mentioned that. So the proposal basically
I've been looking for a proposal all my life.
well, here we go. So I got one.
I wasn't talking about that kind of proposal.
But we'll talk about that later. Anyway, so what you essentially have is we have the 20 budget functions that do exist. Let's say we wanted to start next year, okay? So next year, Congress would essentially take the largest, or the House, forget the Senate. The Senate can do their own thing.
They always do.
I know, right? The House could essentially take the largest and smallest budget function next year.
But you're saying largest and smallest by budget
By the amount that's spent. So every budget function has their own dollar amount. Income security is the largest. It's about 1.7, 1.8 trillion. We zero out the largest, we zero out the smallest. Leave the other 18. Congress's focuses, the House's focuses on those two. Then in the subsequent year, we then take the second largest and the second smallest, focus on those. In the third year, so on and so forth. So that what the House is really doing is that over a 10-year period, you've truly examined the budget because to your point, it's so voluminous. Where is the time and the manpower to actually zero out the entire budget in one calendar year? I would argue
what happens
it
to
doesn't
the
exist.
other functions while you're
They would stay in
examining
place, they would stay in place and would follow the baseline that CBO will produce, but it will put Congress on the path to actually clearing out certain sectors of the budget in a systematic approach. Sorry, Mr. Chairman, I'm 20 seconds over. I'll yield.